Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching the dawn break over the Pacific on June 2, 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor carried within him a terrible prescience that his subordinates mistook for pessimism. 6 months earlier, his surprise attack had awakened a sleeping giant, yet his naval staff celebrated as if they had already won the war. History would remember this moment as the last time the combined fleet sailed with the illusion of invincibility intact. The Japanese Empire had reached its zenith through a series of stunning victories that defied conventional wisdom. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the fall of Singapore, from the conquest of the Dutch East Indies to the humiliation of the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had become floating symbols of Japanese supremacy, their names whispered with reverence in Tokyo and terror in Washington. Yet Yamamoto understood what his colleagues refused to acknowledge. The attack on Pearl Harbor, despite its tactical brilliance, had been a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. As reports from the Naval General Staff crossed his desk detailing American industrial capacity, he realized Japan had committed the same fatal error that had doomed Napoleon against Russia and Germany against the combined might of the Allies in the previous World War. They had awakened an enemy whose resources dwarfed their own, whose capacity for sustained warfare would prove inexhaustible. The planning for Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll, reflected this dangerous overconfidence. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind Pearl Harbor, had crafted another audacious plan. The small American outpost, located 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, would serve as bait to lure the remnants of the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. Once destroyed, Japan would achieve the strategic breathing space necessary to consolidate its conquests and force America to negotiate a favorable peace. But historical precedent suggested otherwise. Admiral Heihachiro Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905 had taught the world that naval battles could determine the fate of empires in a single afternoon. The irony was not lost on Yamamoto that his nation, which had benefited from such decisive action against the Russian Baltic Fleet, now risked everything on the same principle. The difference lay in the enemy they faced. Unlike Tsarist Russia, struggling with internal revolution and fighting at the end of extended supply lines, America possessed the industrial might to rebuild its fleet faster than Japan could sink it. Intelligence reports trickling in from Hawaii painted an ominous picture. The Americans had somehow reconstructed their Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown represented not just ships, but symbols of American resilience. More troubling still were reports of unusual radio traffic and the movement of aircraft toward Midway itself. Yet Japanese naval intelligence, intoxicated by previous victories, dismissed these warnings as American bluffs designed to mask their weakness. This analysis draws from records maintained by the Japanese Naval History Department as referenced in official War College studies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not merely the outcome of a battle, but the trajectory of the Pacific War itself. As Yamamoto's massive fleet steamed toward its destiny, history held its breath, waiting to judge whether the lessons of the past would prove stronger than the intoxication of present success. The complexity of Operation MI revealed the dangerous confidence that had infected Japanese strategic thinking by early June 1942. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the First Air Fleet, consisting of 4 fleet carriers protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Simultaneously, Admiral Nobutake Kondo led the main body, while Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya commanded the northern force attacking the Aleutian Islands. This division of strength violated the fundamental principle of concentration of force that had guided successful naval operations since Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 aboard the Hiryu, had privately questioned this dispersal of strength. A student of naval history and one of Japan's most capable carrier commanders, Yamaguchi understood that their opponents possessed significant advantages in intelligence gathering and defensive positioning. The American ability to read Japanese naval codes, though unknown to the attacking force, had already begun to tilt the scales of fate. Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptographers at Station Hypo had penetrated the Japanese JN-25 code, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. The Japanese plan called for a preliminary bombardment of Midway to suppress its air defenses, followed by a second strike to eliminate remaining resistance. Once the atoll fell, Japanese forces would establish a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. The psychological impact of such a victory, combined with the destruction of the remaining American carrier force, would presumably force President Franklin Roosevelt to seek a negotiated settlement. This assumption revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of American political resolve that echoed Imperial Germany's miscalculations regarding British determination during the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself grounded aboard the Akagi due to an emergency appendectomy. His absence would prove more significant than anyone imagined, as his replacement lacked both his experience and his instinctive understanding of carrier operations. The intricate choreography of flight deck operations, involving the arming, fueling, and launching of aircraft while maintaining defensive readiness, required split-second timing and flawless execution. Any disruption in this delicate balance could prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, American preparations proceeded with methodical efficiency. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 aboard the Yorktown, had received detailed intelligence regarding Japanese intentions and timing. Admiral Raymond Spruance, leading Task Force 16 with the Enterprise and Hornet, positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, perfectly situated to launch a surprise attack on the approaching Japanese fleet. The Americans had learned from their defeats in the Coral Sea and Java Sea that carrier warfare required precise coordination and concentrated force application. The night of June 3rd brought reports of Japanese submarines taking positions around Hawaii, confirming American intelligence estimates of the attack's timing. At Midway itself, Marine Corps and Navy pilots prepared for what they knew would be a desperate defense of their tiny outpost. Lieutenant Colonel James Roosevelt, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 221, briefed his pilots on the importance of their mission. Every American aircraft that could reach the Japanese carriers represented a potential war winner, as the loss of experienced pilots and irreplaceable ships could cripple Japan's offensive capacity for months or even years. These details are corroborated by official U.S. Navy battle reports filed immediately after the engagement. As both fleets converged on the remote atoll, the weight of history pressed down upon every decision. The Japanese, accustomed to victory, sailed toward what they believed would be another triumph in their string of conquests. The Americans, bloodied but not broken, prepared to stake everything on a single throw of the dice. Neither side fully comprehended that the next 24 hours would determine whether the Pacific would become a Japanese lake or remain contested waters where American industrial might could eventually assert itself. Dawn on June 4th, 1942, found Admiral Nagumo's carriers launching their first strike against Midway at 0430 hours. 108 aircraft roared from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their mission to neutralize the American airfield and prepare for the anticipated invasion. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the assault, his bombers and fighters disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness as their carriers turned into the wind for launch operations. This moment marked the beginning of a day that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific War. The attack on Midway proceeded according to plan, with Japanese bombs and bullets raining down on the tiny outpost. Marine defenders, commanded by Colonel Harold Shannon, fought back with desperate courage, their obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters rising to meet the superior Japanese Zeros in what most knew would be a hopeless battle. Yet their sacrifice bought precious time for the heavier American striking forces positioned beyond the horizon. As smoke rose from Midway's installations, Tominaga radioed back to Nagumo with the fateful message that would seal his fleet's doom. There is need for a second attack. Aboard the flagship Akagi, this communication triggered a series of decisions that violated every principle of carrier warfare that the Japanese themselves had perfected. Nagumo, a battleship admiral uncomfortable with the complexities of aviation warfare, faced a terrible dilemma. His second wave, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, sat ready on his hangar decks. Intelligence reports suggested American naval forces might be nearby, yet Tominaga's urgent request for support could not be ignored. The decision to rearm his aircraft for a second land attack would consume precious time and leave his carriers vulnerable during the transition. Captain Minoru Genda, despite his illness, attempted to advise caution, but the momentum of events had already begun to spiral beyond control. Mechanics and armorers swarmed over the aircraft in the hangar decks, switching torpedoes for general-purpose bombs, replacing armor-piercing ordnance with high-explosive charges suitable for ground targets. This process, which would normally take hours under ideal conditions, proceeded under the pressure of combat operations. Fuel lines snaked across deck plates, ammunition carts rolled between aircraft, and the carriers became floating powder kegs waiting for a spark. At 0728 hours, everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched 90 minutes late due to catapult problems, reported the sighting of American ships. The pilot's initial message proved maddeningly vague. Have sighted 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed more than 20 knots. Nagumo's staff studied this report with growing alarm, but the crucial question remained unanswered. Did this force include aircraft carriers? The American striking force, commanded by Admiral Spruance, had indeed been spotted. Task Forces 16 and 17, with their 3 carriers and supporting vessels, represented the concentrated might of the remaining Pacific Fleet. Unlike their Japanese opponents, the Americans had maintained focus on their primary mission, the destruction of enemy carriers. While Nagumo wavered between land and sea targets, Spruance had already committed his aircraft to an all-out attack on the Japanese fleet. These operational details are documented in post-battle analyses conducted by the Naval War College, as cited in official military histories. The next 30 minutes would prove decisive. As mechanics continued their frantic efforts to rearm Japanese aircraft, American dive bombers and torpedo planes were already winging toward their targets. The doctrine of concentration of force, ignored by Japanese planners who divided their strength across multiple objectives, was about to exact its terrible price. History had taught that naval battles turned on moments of decision, and Nagumo's hesitation at this crucial juncture had handed the initiative to his enemies. At 0920 hours on June 4th, the first wave of American attackers appeared on the horizon, and Admiral Nagumo's worst fears materialized. The scattered formations of Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown approached at wave-top level, their obsolete aircraft struggling against the superior speed and firepower of Japanese Zero fighters. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet in what would become one of the most gallant and tragic attacks in naval aviation history. Of the 15 aircraft in his squadron, only Ensign George Gay would survive, floating in the Pacific to witness the destruction that would follow. The slaughter of American torpedo squadrons seemed to confirm Japanese superiority as Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed wave after wave of attacking planes. Captain Mitsugu Mori aboard the Kaga watched with satisfaction as burning American aircraft tumbled into the sea, their crew's sacrifice apparently meaningless against the disciplined defense of the First Air Fleet. Yet this Pyrrhic victory contained the seeds of disaster, as the low-level attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At 0:10:24 hours, Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers far below, their flight decks crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. The Enterprise Air Group, having searched unsuccessfully for the enemy fleet, had found their targets by following the destroyer Arashi as it raced to rejoin the formation after depth-charging an American submarine. This chance encounter would prove to be one of those pivotal moments upon which the fate of nations turns, as McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks with perfect timing and devastating effect. The next 6 minutes witnessed the destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. Lieutenant Richard Best's section concentrated on the flagship Akagi, their 1,000-pound bombs smashing through the flight deck into the hangar spaces where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. The resulting explosions and fires transformed the pride of the combined fleet into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, the Kaga suffered similar damage as Lieutenant Commander Norman Kleiss and his wingmen delivered their ordnance with deadly precision. Captain Jisaku Okada watched helplessly as his ship's forward elevator was blown completely out of its shaft, carrying aircraft and personnel into the sky in a grotesque fountain of destruction. The Soryu met her fate moments later as Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's bombing squadron from the Yorktown achieved perfect coordination with their Enterprise counterparts. 3 direct hits in rapid succession doomed Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto's carrier, the explosions igniting aviation gasoline and ordnance in a chain reaction that defied all attempts at damage control. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews dead or dying in the wreckage of their aircraft. Only the Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, remained operational from Nagumo's once mighty force. Yamaguchi, perhaps the most capable carrier commander in the Japanese Navy, immediately launched a counterattack against the American fleet. His pilots, among the most skilled in naval aviation, managed to locate and damage the Yorktown in a display of professional competence that honored their burning consorts. Yet even this success came at a terrible price, as American fighters and anti-aircraft fire exacted their toll on irreplaceable aircrew. This sequence of events is meticulously documented in after-action reports filed by surviving Japanese officers, as preserved in naval archives. The transformation of the battle from apparent Japanese victory to catastrophic defeat occurred with stunning rapidity. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring events from his distant flagship, received reports that must have seemed impossible. In the space of 6 minutes, the combined fleet had lost 3/4 of its carrier strength and hundreds of experienced pilots who could never be replaced. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had guided Japanese naval thinking since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima, had indeed produced a decisive result. Unfortunately for Japan, they had been on the receiving end of the destruction they had planned to inflict upon their enemies. The destruction of the Hiryu at 1700 hours completed the annihilation of Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most capable naval commanders, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of this unprecedented defeat. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto spoke volumes about the psychological impact of the disaster. "I am partly responsible for the failure of today's operations. I will remain on board to the end." This act of seppuku by one of the Imperial Navy's brightest stars symbolized the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective strategic weapon. Admiral Spruance's decision to withdraw his forces eastward during the night hours demonstrated the tactical wisdom that would characterize American operations for the remainder of the war. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, who had consistently divided their forces and pursued multiple objectives simultaneously, Spruance understood the principle of concentration that had guided successful naval commanders from Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar to Admiral Jellicoe at Jutland. Having achieved his primary objective of destroying enemy carriers, he refused to be drawn into a night surface action where Japanese superiority in such engagements might reverse his hard-won victory. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the loss of 4 carriers and their air groups. Japan's capacity to conduct major offensive operations in the Pacific had been permanently crippled. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, remained under repair following damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier. The light carriers Ryujo and Junyo possessed neither the aircraft capacity nor the experienced pilots necessary to replace the lost striking power of the First Air Fleet. Most critically, the death of hundreds of veteran pilots represented an irreplaceable loss that would handicap Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the conflict. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical architect of Pearl Harbor, survived the destruction of the Akagi to witness the collapse of his carefully constructed strategy. His post-battle analysis, conducted from a hospital bed in Japan, identified the fundamental flaws that had doomed Operation MI from its conception. The division of forces between the Aleutian diversion and the main attack had weakened both efforts. The complex timing requirements, dependent upon perfect coordination between widely separated fleet elements, had proven impossible to maintain under combat conditions. Most damaging of all, the assumption that American morale and industrial capacity could be broken by a single decisive victory had proven catastrophically wrong. The American victory at Midway validated the strategic vision of Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had insisted upon holding the Central Pacific despite pressure to divert resources to the European theater. Their decision to reinforce Hawaii and maintain an aggressive posture in the Pacific had forced Japan to extend its perimeter beyond sustainable limits. The intelligence breakthrough achieved by Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptographers had provided the tactical advantage necessary to position American forces for maximum effect, but the strategic framework that made victory possible had been established months earlier through careful planning and resource allocation. Captain Joseph Rochefort himself observed the profound implications of the victory during his post-battle briefings with Admiral Nimitz. The Japanese had committed the classic error of assuming their opponents would react according to predetermined patterns. By maintaining operational security while penetrating enemy communications, American forces had achieved the kind of intelligence advantage that military theorists had dreamed about but rarely witnessed in practice. The ability to know enemy intentions while concealing one's own had transformed what should have been a closely contested battle into a devastating ambush. These strategic assessments draw from classified military intelligence reports declassified decades after the war's conclusion. As news of the disaster reached Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito himself reportedly questioned the wisdom of continuing a war against such a formidable opponent. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, now faced the prospect of a prolonged defensive struggle against an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed their own. The lessons of history, ignored in the intoxication of early victory, had reasserted themselves with terrible clarity in the waters around a tiny atoll that most Japanese had never heard of until it became their graveyard. The aftermath of Midway revealed the fragility of Japan's extended empire in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, who had predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year before American industrial might asserted itself, found his prophecy fulfilled with prophetic accuracy. The combined fleet limped back to its bases, having suffered not merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe that would reshape the entire character of the Pacific War. The initiative, seized so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, had passed irrevocably to the United States Navy. Emperor Hirohito's reaction to the news demonstrated the profound shock that reverberated through Japan's leadership. The official communique, carefully crafted to minimize the appearance of disaster, claimed a great victory, while quietly acknowledging the loss of 1 carrier and several smaller vessels. This deception, necessary to maintain public morale, prevented Japanese society from understanding the true magnitude of their defeat. The contrast with American transparency, where President Roosevelt frankly acknowledged earlier defeats while promising ultimate victory, highlighted fundamental differences in how democracies and authoritarian regimes respond to military setbacks. General Hideki Tojo, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister and War Minister, found himself confronting strategic realities that his earlier optimism had dismissed. The assumption that American resolve would crumble after a series of military defeats had proven spectacularly wrong. Instead of seeking negotiated peace, the United States had demonstrated an almost inexhaustible capacity for absorbing losses while building strength for future operations. Intelligence reports from Washington indicated that American shipyards were already laying down dozens of new carriers, their construction schedules suggesting that Japanese naval aviation would soon face overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The human cost of Midway extended beyond the loss of ships and aircraft to encompass the destruction of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of the Pearl Harbor air attack, noted in his post-war memoirs that the death of so many veteran pilots represented a blow from which Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Unlike American training programs, which emphasized rapid expansion and standardized instruction methods, Japanese pilot training remained an elite system that produced smaller numbers of highly skilled aviators. The loss of experienced flight leaders and instructors created a crisis in aviation training that would plague Japanese operations for the remainder of the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, recognized immediately that Midway represented a strategic turning point rather than merely a tactical victory. His post-battle analysis identified several factors that had contributed to American success: superior intelligence gathering, concentrated force application, and most importantly, the willingness to accept tactical risks in pursuit of strategic objectives. The decision to commit all available carrier strength to the defense of Midway, rather than holding forces in reserve for future operations, had demonstrated the kind of strategic boldness that characterized successful naval commanders throughout history. The ripple effects of the Japanese defeat extended throughout the Pacific theater. Australian forces, who had been preparing for possible invasion following the fall of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, suddenly found themselves positioned for offensive operations rather than desperate defense. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, began planning for the reconquest of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The Royal Navy, which had suffered humiliating defeats in Southeast Asian waters, started shifting modern carriers and battleships back to Pacific operations. These strategic implications are detailed in classified planning documents from Allied headquarters, later released through historical research programs. Most significantly, the Battle of Midway had validated the aircraft carrier as the dominant weapon system in naval warfare, relegating the mighty battleships that had defined naval power for centuries to supporting roles. The Japanese, who had pioneered carrier aviation tactics and demonstrated their effectiveness at Pearl Harbor, had been defeated by their own innovations turned against them. American naval aviation, riding in the smoke and flame of 4 Japanese carriers, had learned lessons that would guide their operations from Guadalcanal to Tokyo Bay. The age of the battleship was ending, and with it, the strategic assumptions that had guided naval warfare since Admiral Nelson's time. The strategic consequences of Midway became apparent in the months following the battle, as American industrial capacity began translating theoretical potential into operational reality. The shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Puget Sound launched new carriers at a pace that Japanese planners had deemed impossible. The Essex-class carriers, superior in every respect to their predecessors, began joining the Pacific Fleet in numbers that dwarfed Japan's ability to replace their losses. Admiral Ernest King's prediction that American industry would bury the Japanese Navy under an avalanche of ships and planes was materializing with mathematical precision. Japanese attempts to rebuild their carrier aviation force encountered obstacles that their pre-war planning had failed to anticipate. The Shokaku and Zuikaku finally returned to service after repairs, operated with air groups composed largely of inexperienced pilots whose training had been abbreviated due to fuel shortages and the pressing need for replacement aircrew. Commander Minoru Genda, now serving as an air staff officer, reported that the average flight time of new pilots had dropped from over 700 hours to less than 300 hours, a reduction that made them easy prey for increasingly experienced American aviators. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 demonstrated the changed balance of power in the Pacific. Admiral Frank Fletcher's task force, centered on the Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, engaged a Japanese force built around the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku in a series of airstrikes that revealed the declining quality of Japanese naval aviation. While both sides suffered damage, the Japanese inability to achieve decisive results against inferior numbers of American ships highlighted their deteriorating tactical effectiveness. The loss of the light carrier Ryujo, sunk by American dive bombers, further reduced Japan's already limited carrier strength. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, began receiving intelligence reports that revealed the strategic impact of Midway on Japanese home defense planning. The diversion of experienced pilots to carrier replacement duties had weakened Japan's land-based fighter squadrons, creating vulnerabilities that American bombing campaigns would eventually exploit. The decision to maintain large numbers of aircraft in the home islands for defense against anticipated American attacks further reduced the forces available for offensive operations in the Pacific. Admiral William Halsey, assuming command of South Pacific operations following a period of medical treatment, brought an aggressive tactical philosophy that reflected American confidence restored by the Midway victory. His famous directive to kill Japs, kill more Japs captured the spirit of an American Navy that no longer feared Japanese capabilities. The psychological impact of defeating the supposedly invincible combined fleet had transformed American naval culture from defensive to offensive thinking, enabling the kind of aggressive operations that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese response to their declining fortunes revealed fundamental weaknesses in their strategic planning apparatus. The decision to reinforce Guadalcanal through destroyer runs, rather than accepting the loss of the island, demonstrated the kind of strategic inflexibility that had plagued Japanese operations since Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's attempt to lure American carriers into a decisive engagement during the Guadalcanal campaign resulted in further losses that Japan could not afford, including the destruction of the veteran carrier Hiryu's replacement aircrews. These operational assessments are based on captured Japanese planning documents analyzed by Allied intelligence services during and after the war. The transformation of American naval aviation, from the force that had suffered devastating defeats at Pearl Harbor and the Java Sea, into the instrument that would dominate the Pacific, represented one of the most remarkable organizational adaptations in military history. The lessons learned from early defeats, combined with the confidence gained at Midway, created a fighting force that Japanese planners had never anticipated. The assumption that American democracy lacked the spiritual strength for sustained warfare had proven as false as every other calculation that had led Japan into a war they could not win. By December 1942, 6 months after Midway, the strategic situation in the Pacific had been completely reversed. Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded a fleet that included 8 operational aircraft carriers, with dozens more under construction in American shipyards. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, in contrast, possessed only 4 operational carriers, 2 of which operated with partially trained air groups that bore little resemblance to the elite formations that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The arithmetic of industrial warfare, dismissed by Japanese planners who believed superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, had asserted itself with inexorable logic. The death of Admiral Yamamoto himself in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville, symbolized the collapse of Japanese strategic thinking. The intelligence breakthrough that enabled this targeted assassination represented the same kind of cryptographic advantage that had made the Midway victory possible. Commander Joseph Rochefort's successors continued reading Japanese naval codes with devastating effectiveness, turning Japanese communications into weapons against their own forces. The assumption that secure communications would protect Japanese strategic planning had proven as illusory as every other technological advantage they had claimed. Emperor Hirohito's private conversations with court officials, recorded in documents discovered after the war, revealed his growing understanding that the conflict had become unwinnable. The emperor, who had approved the attack on Pearl Harbor based on assurances of quick victory, now confronted the reality of a prolonged struggle against an opponent whose resources appeared limitless. The industrial statistics that reached Tokyo painted a picture of American production that dwarfed Japan's capacity to respond. American shipyards launched more aircraft carriers in 1943 than Japan possessed in their entire fleet, while American aircraft production exceeded Japanese totals by margins that made meaningful competition impossible. General Hideki Tojo's attempts to revise Japanese strategy in light of the changed circumstances revealed the fundamental flaws in the decision-making process that had led to war. The assumption that early victories would create negotiating leverage had ignored historical precedents dating back to Admiral Horatio Nelson's campaigns against Napoleon. Democratic nations, once aroused to full-scale warfare, possessed staying power that authoritarian regimes consistently underestimated. The example of Britain's resistance during the darkest days of 1940 should have warned Japanese planners that democracies often grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The final irony of the Midway campaign lay in its validation of Japanese innovations in naval warfare. The tactics that American forces used to destroy the First Air Fleet had been pioneered by the Japanese themselves during their string of early victories. The concentration of carrier aircraft in massed strikes, the coordination between different attack groups, and the emphasis on hitting enemy carriers before they could launch their own aircraft all represented lessons that Japanese naval aviators had taught through their own successes. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Frank Fletcher had simply applied Japanese tactical innovations more effectively than their originators. The strategic lessons of Midway extended far beyond the immediate context of the Pacific War to influence naval thinking for generations. The demonstration that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the primary instruments of naval power validated theories that aviation pioneers had advocated for decades. The importance of intelligence gathering and code-breaking in modern warfare became axiomatic for military planners worldwide. Most fundamentally, the battle proved that technological superiority without adequate industrial backing was insufficient for sustained warfare against opponents with superior production capacity. These long-term strategic implications are analyzed in post-war studies conducted by military colleges and strategic research institutions worldwide. Admiral Nimitz's final assessment of the Midway campaign, delivered to a joint session of Congress in 1946, captured the essential lesson that Japanese planners had failed to grasp. The enemy made the mistake of believing that a single blow, however devastating, could determine the outcome of a war between industrial nations, he observed. They ignored the fundamental truth that wars are won not by individual battles, but by the sustained application of superior resources over time. The Japanese naval planners who had dismissed historical precedent in favor of wishful thinking had indeed rewritten their nation's future, but not in the manner they had intended. The Battle of Midway stood as eternal testimony to the wages of hubris, demonstrating that even the most carefully crafted military plans must account for enemy capabilities and industrial realities. The lesson, written in the wreckage of 4 aircraft carriers in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, would echo through military academies and strategic planning centers for generations to come.